Today we're going to focus on particle emitter 3D, and it's quite a deep effect, and there's a lot of settings, but I just want to show you some of the things that really caught my eye with these effects. And I think probably the best thing to do to start with, for those of you who haven't used the effect, is just do a quick overview and a brief introduction. Then we're going to build something from scratch. Then we're going to look at just some of the presets that I created and how you might create variations. So you've been given a link to the work file. So if you feel like it, boot up After Effects and open that work file, and you can follow along. It's all about having fun and experimenting and seeing what you can come up with. So I've got a composition here. This is in my project panel. This is composition 01, and in there I have a solid called Start. So that's the best place to start. So I'm going to choose Effect BCC10, BCC10 Particles, and BCC Particle Emitter 3D. So when I do that, you can see I just get a default particle setup. I've got an emitter here. It's just shooting out white particles. And let's take a look over here in the Effect Control panel. This is a very big effect. There are a lot of parameters, and when you look at it like this, you can see it doesn't look too overwhelming. But if I just hold down the Command key on Mac or the Control key on Windows, and just click on this twirling button, or this little twirly in the top left, and then open them again. So try it again, Control or Command click. You can see I can open up all of the parameters. And that goes for all of the effects in After Effects. It's a really handy way for opening up all of the parameters. And some of these graphs and gradients are actually kind of hidden inside the effect. This is a really good way to quickly be able to visualize them or see them and see where they are. But you can see this is a very big effect, and there's a lot of parameters. And it can be very overwhelming to start with. It's very difficult to find things. So that's a good way to work, is just use Command or Control, click on that twirly. I've done it again, and you can see I've closed everything up again. So what I like to do is when I'm working, is say I'm working on the emitter, I'll twirl that down, I'll do my work, and then I'll twirl that back up again. So just staying really organized, otherwise you can get lost. All right, so let's take a look. Now, up the top here we have Effects, Presets, and Docs. And you might like to start here just by clicking on FX Browser and just launching the Effects Browser and just taking a look at some of the presets. Now the presets that I've created aren't actually in here yet. Looking forward to them being in a future version. Sometimes that's a good place to start. You don't want to, especially with particle generators, you don't want to necessarily start from the default effect all the time. Sometimes it's better to do that because you haven't, all of the settings are at their defaults, which can make it easy to generate a custom look. But sometimes you're in a hurry, and say if I wanted a star field, this example here might be a really good place to start. Just save me a few clicks. It's going to cancel that. Next we have the render settings. I'm going to show you some of the key features or the key settings, most important settings with these different categories. And obviously anti-aliasing is really important. You can see this is set to none. And when I created the presets, I basically worked at none most of the time. And to be honest with you, I often left some of them at none because they look pretty good at none. So I suggest when you're working, work at none and only increase the anti-aliasing if you think, it needs it. Otherwise, just leave it at none. It will be much faster for you. And also in here we have motion blur settings. And the same here, work with it off and then try motion blur once you've got the setup that you like. I found that these fast settings were more than enough for what I needed. Next we have use comp lights, built-in lights, and comp camera. And we're going to look at these a little bit later, but the interesting thing is you can check use comp lights and use built-in lights together, so you can use both. And often what I like to do with these kind of effects is I like to use the built-in lights just to give my main illumination, and then I'll use the comp lights, and I might just place a composition light somewhere around the scene just to add a bit of color, just to really sculpt the look that I'm after. It's sculpt in light, of course, that is. Next we have the emitter settings, obviously very important. Key settings here are things like birth rate, how many particles are going to be born, and things like particle speed. So, if I choose, from the emitter shape, if I choose a sphere and I change the particle speed, bring it right down, you can see I actually get a spherical shape. Let's go to undo that. You also have some of the random settings, things like lifespan random, and also gravity. Gravity is obviously very important when it comes to particles. We'll be coming back through some of these settings when we look at these other setups. Next we have next we have particles, excuse me. And this is where we choose the custom particles. You can see the particle shape is set to image collection, and we can choose a range of different particles, but for image collection, if I twirl down image collection, you can see I can choose from a range of different images. Now this effect also has some 3D particles, things like spheres, cylinders, cards, discs and cubes. I'm going to choose spheres. And notice when I do that, that they're completely white, and obviously they're very aliased because anti-aliasing is set to none. In order to see the 3D particle, I have to actually turn on some lights. So I'm going to click on Use Built-in Lights, and there you go. Now we can see the 3D sphere, and it's pretty handy to have the built-in 3D objects. Other things you can do under particles, use things like change the color. I'm going to just choose a red for this. And you've got things like opacity evolution and size evolution. We'll be looking at those in a moment, and also different blend modes. Next we have transform particle, and here you set things like orientation, rotation, scale. If I was to scale, for example, these particles down, I can get more of a sort of blood kind of look, or a blood platelet. And you can see by doing that, now I can do things like change the orientation, and also use settings like tumble and spin. So we get that kind of look. Obviously the particles aren't living very long at the moment. Next we have physics mode. Now physics mode by default is set to external forces, and you can see there's also an interaction with layers option. If I choose that, you can see now external forces becomes grayed out and interaction with layers becomes active. And if I twirl that down, you can see there's lots of settings for how to interact with other layers in After Effects, or the host that you're using. I'm going to use external forces, and under here we have what I think some of the most fun settings, things like wind, circular movement. There's a sinkhole. Let's just adjust the air resistance a little bit. So if I pull air resistance up, you can see that pulls the particles right back into that spherical shape. Leave that at 0. Wind is useful because you can get some really nice natural looks with this, and also obviously this is somewhat similar to gravity. You can use this in conjunction with gravity to create some really nice complex looks. Just push this out with Wind Z. And also circular movement. If I just increase circular movement, you can see when I preview this, as they get pushed out by the wind, they're also moving in a circular fashion. And we'll look at that again in a moment. Just going to undo that. Sinkhole is kind of fun. You can see when I activate sinkhole, I get a sinkhole point, and I can move it around, and the particles are going to move towards that hole. And if I increase the sinkhole pull, or the sink pull, you can see they're pulled into that hole, which is really nice. And if you go too far, it pulls them out the other side. You see you get some quite interesting effects doing that. And also we have spherical warpers, and we're going to look at those in a moment. So let's just turn off this sinkhole. Next we have fractal field. I might just come back and I'll just turn off this rotation, circular movement. Yes, I have done that. Fractal field's great for creating more organic looks. Things like movement noise, size noise, and opacity noise. If I just increase movement noise, now we're going to get a lot more sort of organic motion. And size and opacity. So this is the kind of thing that I use. Fractal field would be something that I use when I've really kind of got my particles basically set up and I'm just fine tuning. You can see how you can create more organic kinds of particles, things like snow and rain, that sort of thing, using this kind of setting. Spawn particles. Spawn particles is probably my favorite section because it allows me to do some really interesting things with particles. Now by default it's turned off. I'm going to choose continuously, and you can see it looks like they look like lentils, don't they? Blood and lentils. You can see that our particles are spawning more particles at a rate of 4 particles a second. If I increase that, you can see we start to get some trails behind the particles. I'm going to change my particle back to something that's a little more suitable. Let's just choose the image collection. That's going to give me the round white blur. There we go. And just come back to my transform. Sorry, not that. Come back to, you can see how easy it is to get lost. Come back to transform particle and just change this back to 100. Okay. So we've got sort of a spaghetti kind of look. So I come back down to spawn particles and just change the size of the particle. Let's bring it down to, say, 2. And let's see, we want to change the color. So at the moment, it's set to 1 color. What I want to do is I want to inherit the color from the main particle. So if I change the inherent color to 100, now we get a red particle. We'll be looking a lot at spawn particles in a moment. Now, we also have effects. This is fairly simple. We have a mirror mode, which is pretty self-explanatory. If I just choose left here, now we're mirroring the particles. It's kind of like a bug, doesn't it? It's the thing about particle effects. The more you play with them, the more you can come up with interesting things, unexpected things. And there's also a dispersion parameter in here. So I just changed dispersion master. I've got my particles starting to spread out in the scene. So handy to have a master dispersion there. The last view here we have transform system. So once you've got your particles set up, you can change the scale of the system, rotate the system. Pretty self-explanatory. Built-in camera settings. So if you're not using an After Effects camera or a host camera, you can just use these settings here. Built-in lights, and there's a range of different lights that you can have. And also motion tracker settings, which I haven't used. Handy to be able to track the particles, and also global settings. Now the key feature here in global settings is random seed, obviously. Once you've set your particles up, you can just come in and adjust the random seed to zero in on just the look that you want. Okay, so this is just a lightning tour through the effect. Why don't we build something from scratch now? Just something fairly simple. So I'm going to just delete that effect and just apply it again. Now, to do this, we're going to, under emitter, instead of using the emitter shape, I'm going to, so instead of using point for the emitter shape, I'm going to choose layer map. That's going to allow me to use an After Effects layer as my emitter, and I'm going to use this text layer. Just got a text layer inside a pre-comp here, and I'm going to choose for emitter layer text. And now we have the text emitting particles. This is always really handy for motion graphics looks. So let's just change some settings here. First of all, I want to add a camera. And my machine's finished backing up, that's good. First of all, I want to add a camera, so I'm just going to drop a camera in here and click OK. And I find the best way to control the camera is using a null, so I'm going to right click on that and I'm going to choose Camera, Create Orbit Null, and that links the camera to a null. Now if I rotate that null object on the Y, you can see I can rotate around my scene, but notice how the particles aren't moving. That's because I need to come back down to the effects and choose Use Comp Camera. Okay, so now if I rotate the camera, you can see I can rotate around my particles as well. These are 3D particles. Really nice. Okay, so I've got my camera set up. All right, so what's next? Let's come in and adjust the emitter. So let's change the birth rate to 100. And the particle speed I'll drop right down to 20. Come down to particles. And I want to change the particle size slightly. Just bring that down. 25. Now I want to use size evolution, so I'm going to turn size evolution on, and I'm going to twirl down the size evolve graph. Remember I said that some things are fairly hidden. You can see that graph it's pretty difficult to very quickly see where the graph is because it's just hidden amongst the other text. All you can do is see this arrow. That's when it's good to command click on the effect just to see all the graphs. But you can see I've activated size evolution. I can twirl that down. And I want to use an up ramp for this. So I'm just going to click on this little ramp here. And now the particles are going to start small and they're going to finish at their full size. Like that. Okay, so now we want to play with the color. So let's just bring these guys back up and come down. You can see it being systematic is a much better way because you don't get lost. So for color mode, I want to choose gradient random, and you can see that's already changed the color of the particles. And by default, the color gradient is this one here. Now this is the, if I just twirl that back up, actually gradient preset, here we go. Yeah, this is the red-yellow preset. There's a range of different presets you can choose from, and obviously you can create your own using these, clicking on these swatches and changing the colors. Not sure if you can actually save your own presets. Yes, you can. So set your own up and click Save. Now we also want to turn on opacity evolution. So I'm going to click on Use Opacity Evolution. And same for this one, I'm going to use a, let's see, what do I want to do for this? I want them to fade out at the end. So for this one, I'm going to choose a down ramp. Actually, this is opacity evolve. So I want them to evolve using an up ramp. So I want it to start off invisible and then come to full opacity. Okay, so that's the basic settings for the particles. Now I'm going to come down to spawn particles, and I'm going to choose continuously, and I'm going to bump up the rate right up to 100. So now we're getting these nice streaks. I'm going to increase, let's see, now I'm going to decrease the life. What's life set up? No, it's 1. So let's increase the life to 5. And I'm just going to adjust the gravity slightly, just increase that to 2. So now these just start to drop down a little bit. And it's good when you're creating particle effects, just change one setting and just do a little preview, either by ramp previewing or just dragging your time indicator, just to get a sense of what they're doing. Because if you change a bunch of different settings, it's very easy to get lost and create a mess. Okay, so now we want to inherit some of the settings from the main particles. So let's see, I'm going to just drop inherit size down. That makes them a little thinner, otherwise a little too thick. And inherit color, you can see they're green at the moment. I'm going to create, just set inherit color to 100. So now they're exactly the same color as the parent particles. I also want to use opacity evolution. And for this one, I just took my eye off it and I lost it for a second there. Just twirl that down. I want to use a down ramp because you can see if I just turn that off again, you can see they're quite thick towards the end. But if I just turn that on, they start to fade out, which is really nice. Just do a little preview of that. Okay, so now we've got this nice little spike sort of coming out of the text. Looking good. You can see it's pretty fast. Okay, so going to twirl that guy back up and come down to external forces. So here's where you can start to play with these effects. So obviously things like wind. You can see I push that across to the right. I get a little particle shooting out to the right. Really good for things like sparks. Have them come out directly towards us just by playing with the wind Z. And things like circular movement. If I just increase circular movement, you can see I can get this really nice sort of organic looking spaghetti kind of style. One thing I really like in here, one of these settings, is this ability to fade in the circular movement. You can see circular movement is set to 1. Let's just actually bring that up. It was on 0, bring that up. If I do the frequency, you can see I can get real sort of like coils, or like springs, which is really nice. It's like almost like curly hair. But this fade in circular movement, if I just increase that, what will happen is as the particles are born, they come straight out, but over time they start to move in a circular fashion, which is really nice. So you can get sort of straight at the beginning and they're sort of curving or going in a circular movement towards the end of their life. And we'll look at this in an example a little bit later. Just going to undo that. And also things like the sinkhole. This is great. If I just turn on this, you can see by clicking it, all the particles are pulled towards that. It looks really quite organic. This is really nice. So you can see as they're born, they move towards that sinkhole. Obviously, in these kind of effects, a little can go a long way. You can adjust the sinkhole setting so that it doesn't, pull too hard. This reminds me of the target effector in Cinema 4D. Really handy. You can obviously animate that as well. Really nice. I'm going to turn that off for now. But in this case, I am going to turn on the spherical warper, and I'm going to just click View Sphere Warpers, and I'm going to increase Sphere Warper 1's strength. Just bring that right up. You can see there's my sphere warper. I can move that through the particle system, and it warps that system. So I'm just going to bring the radius right up, something like this. And this is nice. Now we get this sort of particles on the side, and they're being pushed around this sphere. Let's just turn off the View Sphere Warpers. So we get this kind of look. Which is looking really interesting. And obviously you can come back and you can change the particle speed and the amount of particles. But when you're working, you really want to use a fairly low particle count because things can slow down really quickly. And working with particles is all about experimenting, moving fast, and sort of zeroing in on a base look, and then go and increase your particle count and adjust those kind of settings because they're going to slow you down. Let's go down to fractal field, and just going to increase the opacity noise just to make this a little less regular. You can see at 0 we get this kind of flat look, but if I increase the opacity noise, it's a little less regular, adds a little more depth to it. So at this stage, you could probably go in and add some other effects. I was messing around with this, and I just tried some of the other Boris effects. And one of them was under the Stylize menu. This is anything with grunge anything with the word grunge in it, I don't know, drawn to. I just love grunge looks. So I chose Edge Grunge and applied that to it, and instantly everything kind of disappeared. But if I just come in and adjust a few of the settings in here, things like burn width, just decrease that. Drop that down to about 1. And also burn progression. Something like that. You can see we're starting to get this more sort of fiery, hot look. Obviously you can build this kind of look by using multiple different effects, but it's so nice to have this kind of look in a single effect. I can also add in the original just by decreasing, add original. And now if I want to add a bit of a glow to everything, I can just use an adjustment layer. Just press the keyboard shortcut Command Option Y on the Mac. That's Control Alt Y on PC. And for this, I'm going to choose the Boris Fast Film Glow. Really nice glow. Just drop that over the top. And this is where we can, using adjustment layers, a way we can integrate the text in with the effect that we just created. Just going to choose a different color. Make that a bit brighter, and just decrease the glow radius. And now come back to the particle effect and increase the amount of particles and see what that does. Under emitter. So we can thicken things up just by adding more particles. I might just drop that below the text as well. And we come with that kind of look. Obviously that can use a little bit more work, but you can see just by starting off simple and just changing the settings one by one, and then adding a few effects on top with an adjustment layer, we can come up with something that looks pretty unique. And this is the thing about particles, there's so many options. I was playing around with different looks over the last few days, and every time I got back in front of the effect, I thought of something different. I have a finished example here. I just kept it just to sort of compare, and see that's quite different again. Okay, so that gives you a sort of a basic example of how you might build something from scratch. Why don't we take a look at some of the presets that I've created now, and we'll pick out a couple of examples, and we'll adjust them and create some different looks. So the first one is this one here. You can see, obviously I'm using particles and spawn particles here, and as we saw, by changing the spawn particle velocity to 0, we get these strokes. And I've also used motion blur in here, and that's given this kind of smeared look, because I've used one of the rough giraffe settings. And I've also used a sphere warper as well. So it's interesting because it gives you a kind of it looks actually like a sphere. The particles are wrapping around the sphere. And notice here, if I just press U twice on the keyboard, we can see the change parameters. You see anti-aliasing is set to low. Motion blur is set to smooth fast. And I've set a couple of keyframes in here, right down the bottom. Where are they? Keyframes for sys rotate Y on a transform system. So I'm rotating the entire system. And I'm also just zooming in a little bit by animating the built-in camera's cam pos Z, so the position of the camera in Z. So let's just turn off the proxy here, and this is going to give me the live layer, and just to make some adjustments. So the first thing I want to do is I want to come in and click on my effect controls, and I'm going to turn motion blur off just for now. Let's just see the particles here just come in a little way. Might just press, there we go, press 0 just to do a little preview. Just cache some of these frames. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is turn off motion blur. You can see how that motion blur really gave that sort of smeared effect. Just turn that off. And next I'm going to change the particle shape. So just twirl up render and come down to particles. And here I'm going to choose 3D cards. And you can see I've changed the main particle, but obviously the spawn particle is a different particle. We'll come down to that in a moment. So now we have these 3D cards in there. I'm going to turn built-in lights on. And let's go and fix these spawn particles. So I'm going to come down to spawn particles, and for shape, I'm going to choose link shape with master. Okay, so now we have lots and lots of 3D cards coming out, obviously way too many. I'm going to change the rate for spawn particles down to 5. That's better. Much faster as well, obviously a lot less particles. And I'm going to increase the life. I don't want these particles popping off. This is more of a sort of background element that I'm creating here. swirl up spawn particles and come down to external forces. And I'm going to increase circular movement. If I can find it, there we go. Just bring it up to 10. That really spreads these out. You can see they're kind of spinning, rotating as they come out from the emitter. Now, you can see these are black and white. And we saw before that I could change the color of the particles. I changed those 3D spheres to red. I actually quite like working in grayscale because I like to sort of sculpt the color with lights. Now, we've chosen to turn on built-in lights. So I'm going to come down to built-in lights, and you can see enable light L1 is on by default. If it was off, we wouldn't see the effect of that. But I'm going to choose a color for this by clicking on L1 color. I'm going to just choose maybe a sort of gold color. And this light is up, that's the sync position. If I just click on the L1 position XY, you can see it's up underneath the sync position, up here in the top left. I'm going to leave that just up there. And I'm also going to enable light 2. So just come down a little way and enable light 2. And obviously that's a white light. I'm going to make that blue. And I'm going to just change the position of that one as well. So that one's down bottom left. I'm going to make that bottom right. Something like that. So you can see we've actually added, a fair bit of color in there just by changing the color of the lights. And you have other lights as well. You've got light 3. You can add another variation in the color. And it might look a bit muted at the moment, but I don't mind that I haven't got this really, really saturated just yet, because things like saturation and brightness, that kind of stuff, you can think about later. You don't have to work with everything really blown out in color. But this is a good start. Okay, so I'm going to come back up to emitter now. And I want to change the position of the emitter on the Z, so pos Z. So let's just, you can see just by dragging that around, it's a little bit of a lag, but I can get some interesting effects. I don't think I want to use this particular one though. I think I need to come into transform system and change the system center. Yeah, now I can move it towards me or away from me, something like that. And remember, I started with a preset here. So the preset's still got all the rotation keyframes for the Y, and the camera's moving in on it as well, on the Z. But the entire system now is a little bit further away from us. Okay, so that's a base look. Now, when I created this, I started using some other Boris effects, and I actually applied them through an adjustment layer just to save us time. I'm going to turn that adjustment layer on. Now, the first one is BCC Trails. Trails is really handy for creating an echo style effect. So it's a really quick way to sort of increase the count and in a different kind of way. Obviously, it looks like I'll have more particles in here, but you can see how just by turning on trails, I get this sort of glassy, fractured look. Now the trails is set to, let's see, all I've done for trails is basically set the trail count to 10, but I've also rotated the feedback. This is really nice. You can actually see how I can rotate the feedback here. So I get this kind of fractured flower kind of look. So I created a base look with the particles, but I don't have to create the final look with the particles. You can get just a general, look that you're happy with, and go in and experiment with other effects. Now, obviously, this look is also, it's quite jagged, it's quite geometric. I wanted to add a little sort of more organic sort of blurriness to it. So for that, I used BCC temporal blur. Just going to turn that on. And obviously temporal, is to do with time, so it's going to blur these particles over time. And it's a little bit slow because it has to cache the frames that come before. But now you can see I'm starting to get a little bit of smeariness and blurring. Now with this effect, you obviously, the more you bump up the settings, the slower it is. I've got a frame amount set to 10. I could increase that amount to get rid of some of this this stepping in here, but that's going to slow it down. But it's nice how you've got this now combination of sort of sharpness and softness. I'm a big fan of that kind of look. And lastly, I just use a little bit of Boris Fast Film Glow. It's a really handy little glow effect, just to add some overall glow. And of course, I could come in now and apply things like curves. Curves is an often used effect for me, and just bring down the blacks, bring up the whites, maybe just bring up the mid-tone, and you can really start to play around and adjust and zero in on the look you want. Also things like hue and saturation. BCC has its own hue, saturation, and lightness effect. I can come in and just increase the saturation slightly. Let's see, I didn't have to do that with the actual particles, but now I can just do that with another effect. And you might still think that's a little bit dark. You can come in and adjust that even more. But remember, we started with just a preset. Let's just come back to the project panel. This preset here, and we've changed it to be something quite different. I'm going to show you one more. I know we're getting close to the end of the time that we have. This one here, another preset. Now here I've just created a motion path, and I've got the particles just shooting along the path. You can see the spawn particles, the velocity is set to 0, so I've got these nice trails. That's a sort of transition sort of style effect. I'm going to use this to reveal some text. So let's just turn off the proxy. And you can see this is the look that I'm after. So first of all, just going to turn off my fast film glow there. So what I want to do, have a look at the effect here. I've got some keyframes. Let's just press U. You can see I've got keyframes for position X, Y. And that's what's shooting that across the screen. Now actually, just out of interest, I use the motion sketch tool under Window Motion Sketch just to quickly create a path for this. But I want to use this path, I want to use the text as the path. So if we just have a look at before we do that, just have a look. If I double click the particle layer, you can see here in the layer panel, I can actually view the path and adjust the existing path. And that's because I've got view down here set to BCC particle emitter 3D. I'm going to turn render off. And you can see if you've drawn a path and you want to adjust it, that's the way to do it. And that doesn't mean just for Boris effects, that's for any effect that has a path that you want to adjust. But I'm going to remove that path completely. So I have some text here, and this is done in Illustrator, and I just imported this as a path. So I'm going to just twirl that down and twirl down the mask, and just going to click on mask path. Now this is important. I want to select that and copy, and I want to come down to this layer here, and I'm just going to come back to the beginning. I'm going to click on the stopwatch to turn off position XY, click it again, and paste. And you can see how I pasted those keyframes. And a little After Effects trick there that I've known, since I started using After Effects. Interestingly, when you do that, the first and last keyframe are regular keyframes, and all of the keyframes between those two are set to rove across time. And this gives you a nice even speed, a nice linear speed. So you can see now that it's starting to draw around that path. Now the settings need to be adjusted. So I'm going to come in to the effect, and for this I'm going to make some adjustments. So first of all, come into render, set anti-aliasing to none. That's going to speed things up. And for fractal field, I've got a really high movement noise, and that's really what's pushing these particles around. I'm going to make that 0. Now, for the particle's opacity, I'm going to change the opacity random to 100. You really want to play with the random settings. Without these random settings, things can look really fake. The more you randomize them, the more natural they're going to look. And I want to inherit the color. I want the spawn particles to inherit the color of the main particles. So let's come back to spawn particles. And we want to inherit the color. So where's that? Size, inherent color. So I'm going to bring that up to 100. And now we've got the same color as the main particles. You can see that's actually speeding up now. Notice also here that I have actually set keyframes for birth rate, and I've got a very high birth rate, 1500, and then one keyframe later I have a birth rate of 0, and that's going to turn the particles off. Now obviously the particles are going to turn off before the particles finish drawing. Now I could either move these keyframes to occur at the end of the drawing, or I could just leave them where they are. And just because these are roving across time, these keyframes, I can just move this end keyframe and just speed the whole thing up. You can see as I do that, we get a much more angular looking path. But that might not be a problem if things are moving very quickly. Yeah, shoot out quite fast. Just going to bring that back and just bring that back towards the end. Now for the text, I've actually used the stroke effect, and I've just animated the end parameter for the stroke effect, and I've just increased the spacing, the brush spacing. That gives me this dotted look. So I basically sort of matched the speed of the stroke to match the particle speed, and that makes it look like the path is drawing on. And also use the fast film glow effect over the top, just to give everything a nice glow. It's not exactly the same as the one that I created before, the one I baked earlier. You notice also how on this one, the particles look more like dust. That's because I've adjusted the spawn particle setting, where is it? Spawn velocity. Watch what happens if I increase spawn velocity. You can see now we get this sort of separated look, and this is really nice. So it's like someone's throwing dust up in the air. A really nice look, and that gave me that final look. So I've also just duplicated the text layer and just to decrease the opacity, so it looks like these are sort of turned off lights, and the particles are sort of racing through them, and the lights are turning on, or the bulbs are turning on as it flies through. And this could probably use a fair bit more adjustment, but we get this really nice, the way the particles shoot out in different directions because of the path is really interesting. It looks really organic. There's some are coming across to the right, some are shooting down, some are shooting out to the left. So that's how I adjusted the existing preset to come up with that look. So you can see I haven't had to change too many of the settings. I was able to use that preset as a starting point. Some of the other presets that are available, now these are going to be available to you now if you downloaded the project file, but they'll also be included in BCC or in Continuum. I'm getting used to calling it Continuum now. Things like, you can look at them yourself, but things like this, I had a lot of fun just playing around and seeing what was possible, and knowing full well when I was building these that, there's also other infinite possibilities. I probably could have used it for a year, and it made thousands of different looks. But the more I spent time in front of it, the more I was happy with the kind of looks that I was creating. And all of these, obviously, you can use as a starting point and create your own looks.
Hey, John, quick interruption there. I thought I'd just
Yes.
ask you a question. And I'm sorry if there's a lot of noise here. I mean, there's a lot of ambient sound in this room, which is why I didn't interrupt you earlier on. But one thing I wanted to ask you was that what is the system specs that you're using? Because a lot of the stuff that you're working on, we're seeing some real-time particle interaction. What kind
It's
of
funny,
system have you got?
it's funny, because I switched to PC, and I was fairly noisy about it on Twitter. I switched to PC about a year ago, and my usual machine is a big PC workstation, but this is a 2009 Mac Pro.
Oh wow!
Yeah, that I do these demos on. So what's that? 7 years old?
7 years
No,
old.
no, no, more than that.
NVIDIA
So
card, or is it a ATI?
the card I'm using in here is actually NVIDIA card. Yeah, it's actually a Quadro 5000, so it's a reasonably good card.
Yeah.
And I also have to say that I switched out the hard drives in this machine a year or so ago for an otherworld computing what is it, a solid state drive.
Yeah.
So the solid state and the GPU definitely help, but still it's an old machine.
Yeah, but you're still getting some decent movement there on them. I mean,
Yeah, definitely.
very
But that
impressive.
definitely, I think it also, I mean, even so, I was able to bring the PC to its knees if I increased the particle count too high,
Yeah,
or if I was working with motion blur turned on. It's still quite possible to do. This particular preset here, most of these presets took seconds to render. This one took about 30 minutes.
wow.
So, if you
Practices.
want to you can get the detail if you want it, but you've just got to be prepared for a bit of a render hit. So it's good to do sort of, rendering overnight or rendering when you're walking away from your computer.
Yeah. What size are your
So
comps, John?
this particular comp's only 1280 by 720.
Okay. Okay.
So it's it's pretty small.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's also some particle array 3D presets in here, everyone. If you want to take a look, I had a lot of fun using particle array 3D as well. Maybe that's something for another time that we can talk about. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to leave throw the floor open for some questions, if anybody has any.
Yeah, we had a couple, John. Let's see. The very last question. It was a quieter group than usual. You must have had them spellbound. But usually we get like so many questions. But with this group, they're either a very sophisticated user base or you had them spellbound. One or the other.
Well,
But
hopefully everyone's sitting in front of it just playing around with the settings. That's
I
what you
hope
want
so
to
too. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But one question was, can gravity be used to bring the sparks downward? And the answer to that, of course, is
Absolutely.
yes, right? Yeah. Um, Another one was from Marker. Can you use sourced PSD files for particles?
Absolutely, yeah. You can use, I think the ones in here are actually TIFF files.
Yep.
but obviously you can save a TIFF from Photoshop. But you can also use an After Effects layer if you're using an After Effects. So you can have a pre-comped layer which is also animated itself. Yes, obviously, yes, gravity is a really important part of all of this. Without gravity, the particles don't do a whole hell of a lot.
Yeah. Hey, here's one for you. And I know there are multiple methods of doing this, but I'd like to see what your response would be. So let's say, as we saw, a lot of these particles that you've created, they're sweeping from side to side, or they're coming toward the camera. How about pushing away from the camera? Well, I mean, I know personally that you can use multiple different ways to do this. What would be your favorite way to do that, to push them away?
First thing I probably think about using is wind.
Mm.
In this particular case, so let me just, I've got these particles here, let me just turn off these effects, and I just delete the entire effect. Let's just
yeah, because there's going to be multiple different effects depending upon what way you choose to do this, right? I mean, you could use the sync point, obviously you can push that in Z and pull them away from the camera.
Absolutely. But yeah, it depends on. I guess it's nice to have different options, and it's also really nice to have multiple ways, because you might have, for example, let's try something. Let's freestyle. So let's increase the amount of particles. Just change the size for now, and under emitter we want to increase the birth rate, and probably just knock back the particle speed. Okay, something like that. So if you want to move the particles towards the camera, one way would be to use one of the external forces. So that would be wind. So you can see just by adjusting the wind, I can move them towards the camera or away from the camera. But as I said, it's nice to have more than one option. So if they're moving towards the camera, I might now want to use the sinkhole. So I enable the sync point, and now I've got them moving towards the camera and towards the sync point. So I can do two things at once, you know what I mean? And you really want to have the ability to finely adjust the look of this system by using two things that do kind of the same thing. If you've only got one thing that does, like if I only had wind, I didn't have the sync point, I can only create one kind of look. But with both, I can create much more interesting, unique looks, and much more, I can fine-tune the looks much more easily.
John, oh yeah, there you go. Because Graham here is asking, could you show them?
Yeah, see, I'm just adjusting the sync pull, because if I adjust it too much, it's gonna negate the wind.
Yeah.
But if I just change the sync pull, so now they're kind of trying to be, they're blowing out with the wind, but they're kind of moving towards the hole as well, see? See what I mean? So if I was to use the sync to position them in Z, then I've used the sync. I can't use it for anything else.
Yeah.
But if I use the wind to do that, then I can use the sync point to create some nice customization.
And of course, you could always reposition a camera anywhere in 3D space and have them move in any direction.
Well, that's right. So if I just turn my camera on, let's just come back to turn on comp camera, and now if I rotate around this, so I can have them move them back. I can have everything set up and go, okay, now they're moving in Z, but based on where my camera's rotated, so I can have them moving back towards the back of the scene. So great ways to fine-tune the look. But the key here, especially for you beginners with particles, start simple. Change one setting, change the next setting, zero in on the look that you're after. Don't go changing lots and lots of settings at once, because you very, very quickly get lost. And you'll find yourself when you first start out, constantly hitting reset and starting again. And often that's the best way to work. One thing I also like to do is when I am creating particle looks, if I've got something that I like, but it's not quite what I'm after, I'll just save that. Just save it as a preset, or just duplicate that comp and save it, because you're basically building a tool set as you work. There's no sense, doing something and think, oh, that looks cool, and then just deleting it, because it's not what you're after at that moment. So always building your tool set, always looking for to create interesting different looks as you're working. So I think that about wraps it up for now. Obviously, I'm available at MotionWorks on Twitter, or at MotionWorks if you have any questions. But I think that about wraps it up.